Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we have Ben Burgis of the Give Them an Argument podcast. Today I will be asking him to introduce me to the ideas of democratic socialism and what it really means to get at the heart of what leftism is. Mr. Burgis, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
What is democratic socialism?
Sure. So I think that in the original sense of the word, democratic socialism is redundant. It's like saying wet water. But of course, because of the aftermath of the Russian Revolution and the rise of that kind of communism with a capital C that was very authoritarian, now you have to say, democratic socialism to differentiate it from that. But I would say that socialism, broadly speaking, means the idea that the means of production, meaning factories, farms, stores, things like that, should in some sense be socially owned. Different people have different ideas about what that means, rather than owned by certainly external owners who then hire people to work there as wage laborers. That the basic sort of impetus behind socialism, as I've always understood it, is objecting to the division of society into those two classes. So there are different ways that you could do that, and different models of what socialism should look like. I should also make a distinction here, I guess, between social democracy, which or what you could think of as like adopting some socialist policies while basically keeping capitalism, and what I'm really talking about here, which is a kind of socialism that would come after capitalism, saying that the main way of organizing the economy would be something different from what we have now, and in the direction as indicated by democratic socialism, ideally of something that would be more democratic, not less democratic than what we have now. So for example, this could take the form of state ownership if it's a democratic state, but it could also take the form of worker ownership at the firm level. And I don't, depending on where you want to go with this, we could get into that in a more granular way or whatever. But I mean, like that, in broad strokes, certainly that's what I mean by democratic socialism.
Now, as a libertarian, I
Yeah.
would say that libertarianism can be falsified. For example, one would maybe say why initiating aggression is justified, or why a group called the state has a monopoly right to initiate aggression or physical uninvited interference with another person or their justly acquired property. And then I'd say on the economic side, I would say you could refute it by saying why a coercively funded monopoly is economically superior to voluntarily funded competition. How would you falsify democratic socialism?
Yeah. I mean, I think actually that first one that you said, like, I understand a little bit more how you think that the economic argument for libertarianism can be falsified. And in fact, presumably one of the things that we disagree about is whether it has been. But I think that when you start talking about moral principles, like that, your argument from non-aggression, I'm a little bit less clear on. I mean, I think there are arguments against that I find persuasive, but I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm just being too pedantic here. I don't. There's a sense in which it's hard, it's a little unclear what it means to falsify your sort of most basic moral commitments. But look, I mean, I think with democratic socialism, I think you could make parallel moves, right? You could say that certainly, when it comes to what I'm talking about, as far as that kind of socialism that comes after capitalism, well, of course, that hasn't existed. So that makes it harder to falsify any particular prediction about how it would play out. Capitalism has existed. Capitalism with social democratic policies built into it has existed. That kind of authoritarian capitalism has existed. But that's pretty much in terms of modern economies. Those are pretty much the things that have existed. So in a sense, I think you and I have the same falsification problem, since especially because if I followed what you just said correctly, you're not even the sort of standard plain vanilla minimum state libertarian. You don't want to have a state as a monopoly force at all. And so certainly a completely stateless economy has never existed. So I think in terms of, if either you or I make optimistic projections about how this kind of society we would want has turned out, we both have a problem there about the lack of real world precedents. Now, I think that what our next move in both cases would be to say, okay, but let's look at what has existed and what's been successful or unsuccessful, and of course there's a whole different discussion about, successful in doing what, right? In anything that has existed. And so certainly as far as the idea that you could take some things outside of the market, entirely, and that would be a good thing. That you could decommodify some sectors, which is just a fancy word for you no longer buy or sell them, and that could work out for the best. I would point to, for example, the comparative successes of countries that have socialized healthcare in one form or another, compared to the United States, which I understand is not. We don't have the healthcare system that would exist in a libertarian utopia, but it is also one of the most marketized healthcare systems in the entire world. And, and I would say that the track record of socialized healthcare, for example, is really good. Or when it comes to the idea of worker ownership at the firm level, I would point to like the success of the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which is a giant, worker cooperative. And I would more generally argue that the literature on worker co-ops, shows that they, that it's harder for them to get going into the current system, but once they get going, they're just, they were about as successful, they last about as long, as regular traditional capitalist firms. And so I guess all this is just a long-winded way of saying that by the same token of that's how I would argue that if we have empirical evidence that I'm not suggesting anything that's crazy that would lead to economic catastrophe, then I would. But if you could show that the evidence actually showed the opposite on both of those points, that those things were disasters, then you could falsify them. All right, I mean, falsifying something. I guess. All right, I'll just say this quickly and then move on, right? So that they have, when you talk about falsifying things, right? That's a framework that comes from Karl Popper's philosophy of science, and he thought, okay, you can't really verify things; you can only falsify them. That you have, a theory that makes a prediction, the prediction doesn't happen, so the theory must be wrong. One big problem with that, pointed out by W.V. Quine, is that all of our beliefs are mashed up, entangled up together in weird ways. So if you have a piece of evidence that doesn't really fit, then you always have multiple options for what to discard to explain that away. What to say, okay, all of our theories kind of march to the tribunal of evidence together. And so your overall theory, there are always different ways that you can adjust it. All of which is just to say that I think the idea that I think we sometimes have, I think even as a description of how science works, never mind, what we're doing now. I think that the idea that there's this sort of clean one-stroke falsification of anything, is a little dubious. I think you can have evidence that makes things more plausible and evidence that makes things less plausible. Right now, I think that, my contention would be that the evidence, that the evidence works out pretty well for, for thinking that we don't have to, organize the economy the way that we do right now. But I think, it's not, I don't think that there's any difficulty in imagining, evidence that would show otherwise. And I think in terms of the falsification or verification problem, which is, okay, but we don't have anything that's even close to what I advocate, I think we're at least in the same boat there, would be my argument.
I just want to make sure we're sort of on the same page here with
Sure.
definitions.
Sure.
So Karl Marx defined communism. The theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. From that, I would get the definition of socialism: the institutionalized interference with or aggression against private property and private property claims. And then capitalism being a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property and non aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners. Do you see those as legitimate definitions?
Well, I think that the first one, the one thing, and I know this makes, like, I know this is like a slightly annoying thing to say because it might sound like special pleading or whatever, but I think your quote's pulled out of the Communist Manifesto, and I think if you look elsewhere there, you'll actually find Marx making a distinction between private property and personal property, and what he means in context by private property is private property in the means of production. The idea that you have like that there are the people who work at a factory, for example, and then there's a separate person who's the owner of the factory. That's the situation that he's objecting to. I think when it comes to aggression and free contracts and all of that stuff, my big problem with that is basically one that Matt Brunig likes to argue, which is that just talking about, okay, aggression is bad. Fair enough. What does that mean? Well, aggression means that you're either attacking somebody's person, unjustifiably, or you're taking away their stuff. We could nuance that in all kinds of ways, right? But if that's like a good baseline, then you say, okay, well, the problem that comes in with the phrase "you're taking their stuff," right? What does their stuff mean? Well, it can't just mean everything that people have right now, because on any theory of who is morally entitled to what, even a hardcore libertarian one, just what people happen to have at any moment, isn't going to necessarily track that. If nothing else, there's theft. That if somebody, if I take your TV, you're surely not aggressing on me in that libertarian sense by taking it back. So the question really, you used a phrase earlier, the just acquisition, justly acquired property. Okay, well, really, I think the $64,000 question is who, because we're not talking about a legal distinction. Which I think is a really important point to make, right? And we can't be talking about a legal distinction, because if all we meant by you can't take their stuff was stuff that they're legally entitled to, then the libertarian could have no possible objection to taxation because the IRS is legally entitled to part of your paycheck. So we're talking about what people are morally entitled to, which gets to your theory of just distribution. And so I think that I think it's not so much a question of aggression is good or aggression is bad, because we all agree that it's wrong to take things that people have a moral right to take. In fact, it's a kind of an uninteresting tautology. The interesting question is what do people have a moral right to? And the libertarians' theory is going to be that they have a moral right to anything. It gets a little tricky when you start talking about original acquisition and you say, okay, well, what's the, if we were all starting in the, we were all Adam and Eve's children fanning out from the Garden of Eden, right? What would it take for us to legitimately acquire something? But basically however the chips fall on a free market interaction, that's what people have moral right to. And so I think the disagreement I'd have with the libertarian is not, is it bad to aggress against people's legitimate property, but what's legitimate property, right? Is the right theory of legitimate property let the chips fall where they may in a free market, or is the right theory of legitimate property that have something to do with like some idea of fairness or equality or compassion or other values that that might shape what you think different people have a moral right to?
Now, the libertarian view of the world that I have is that the state is unique insofar as it can be recognized as morally justly doing things no other institution can. For example, if I try to issue taxes on others, I would be called a thief. If I tried to conscript people, I'd be called a slave owner. If I committed foreign policy, I'd be a mass murderer. And if I tried to regulate others, I'd be seen rightly so as someone trying to violently dominate innocent people in voluntary interactions. What is the socialist theory of what makes the state a unique institution, if it is at all?
Yeah. So I should qualify this because I think there might be people who are sort of on my side of the argument here, but only sort of, who might get mad at me if I don't, if I legitimately, right? Because I'd be really simplifying things if I didn't say this. So I think that different socialists do have different attitudes towards the state. There's a traditional Marxist idea that the state is something that exists to perpetuate the rule of one class over another class, and once we have a classless society, we won't need a state anymore. That maybe there'll be some residual thing, but it'll like wither away over time. I am, but look, I'm somebody who does think that as little as I might like the existing state because of some of those things that you mentioned, the mass murder and foreign policy, etc. I'm somebody who's skeptical. I'm not enough of an orthodox Marxist to be convinced that we can ever completely do without something like a state. I think that there are, I think that there are reasons why you need something like that, even under, even in a classless society. So what justifies that? Well, I think that one thing that justifies it is just if you think that the right distribution of property isn't just letting the chips fall where they may in a free market. If you think that that fairness, for example, has something to do with it, then as libertarians, like to point out, you're going to have to do something to enforce that. I mean, granted, you have to enforce private property claims too. And I understand that that anarcho-capitalists would say, oh well, that wouldn't be a state. You'll just have private security forces or whatever doing that, which to my mind is like private security forces are something that have all of the disadvantages of the state. They're use violence, all that stuff, but they don't have the primary advantage of at least some states, which is that we can democratically control them. They're only accountable to the people who hire them. But in any case, surely if we don't want to build up fortunes in some people's hands, etc., then we don't want to do it that way. And I think that you could have redistribution carried out, by more decentralized actors. But I think that there's, or for that matter, we don't even need to frame this in terms of redistribution, like just anything that a state does. Like there are some functions of a state that you and I would agree are illegitimate, like invading and bombing other countries. But when it comes to functions of the state that I think are legitimate, you might even agree somebody needs to do, you just don't want the state to do. Like the cliched example is building the roads. But like also, somebody's trespassing on your property and they refuse to leave. As they say in the Ghostbusters, who are you going to call? And then what's going to happen to them later, right? Are they going to, if they're not rehabilitated, if they're going to keep doing it, do they go to some sort of prison? If so, is it a private prison? And I think that there are some reasons to prefer that this be done by some sort of at least somewhat centralized institution that has, that has widespread popular legitimacy. That does, in some sense, reserve its own right to do that, right? That has that monopoly on violence you're talking about, which is, of course, not a literal monopoly in any society. I'm pretty sure that even in Nazi Germany, you could, if somebody attacked you in a back alley, you're allowed to use violence in self-defense. But is a monopoly in certain ways, right? Like it does, if there's a mugging going on and the cops are about to intervene and you say, no, I want to go take care of this myself. No, you're not allowed to do that, right? So it's a monopoly in certain forms, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for because maintaining that monopoly leads to less violence and chaos and bloodshed than not having that monopoly would have, and that if we need to have it, if we do need to have a state, which I think we do in some form or another, then I would rather have it be a democratic state. That I think that people who are ruled over by an institution, should have a right to determine, the outcome of that institution. So I guess the TLDR of my answer would be that what justifies having a state is that if some of these functions need to be performed, we're going to have much better outcomes if we have a state doing it than we do if we have private entities doing it. So it seems like we need some kind of state, and then it's going to be more legitimate if it's democratic. And we could also talk about other state functions, things that I think are legitimate and you don't, like providing people with health care. And I think that there are also good reasons to prefer that those be done by a state. Like I think that people have more autonomy, to determine in practice the course of their lives, and I think that people have more dignity if they're just sort of provided with something automatically as citizens, like healthcare, rather than having to have a plate passed at the church or beg for funds on GoFundMe or stay in the current job because they don't want to lose their employer health insurance.
Now, what would you advocate? So, for example, if we take healthcare or welfare, some people do not support those things. What do you advocate happen to the people who refuse to chip in for those?
Yeah. So what I would add, so in other words, what's the penalty for tax avoidance? And I think that the penalty for tax avoidance, for legitimate taxes, not taxes to goods, funding imperialist wars or other things that would be unjust, but like legitimate taxes by a state that I would support. I would, I think fines, penalties, if you don't, wage garnishment certainly, is something that could happen if somebody doesn't pay those fines and penalties. I'm extremely reluctant to support actual imprisonment for any kind of nonviolent crime. But maybe as the very last resort, if all else fails. But I would also just make one point here before I throw back to you, which is that there is going to be a structurally extremely similar question that I could ask you, which is, okay, if you think that people are entitled to property because of the outcome of some kind of free market process, well, what do you think should happen to people who refuse to respect that property? What do you think, if Bob, got some apartment, building that's currently sitting unused as a result of a free market process, and Jane is squatting there and refuses to leave, right? What do you think should happen to Jane? And I think that the range of possible answers there is presumably not going to be very different, right? That if, because you could say, all right, well, you say that Jane has to leave, like if Jane keeps coming back, maybe you fine her. What do you do if she doesn't pay her fines? And I think that that's going to be a very structurally similar question to what do you do for people who, in what I would regard as a just state, refuse to pay taxes.
You mentioned that something like a private police force would have all the negatives, but none of the upsides. As far as potential upsides, being able to not fund them, I would say, is one of the potential upsides. So as much as you don't like MySpace, Sears, or Blockbuster, our ability to withdraw funds from them and allocate our attention elsewhere is essentially an efficient cleansing mechanism for ridding one group over another. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies from 1955 to 2016, of the 500, there's only 60 that were there at both times. And a lot of them are there because of the state, Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. So I think we'd even have more choices and more options as employees, as workers. An empirical study that I cite is the impact of regulatory costs on small firms. A 2010 study by the U.S. Small Business Administration said big corporations with 500 employees or more pay $7,700 every year per employee to comply with the regulations. Small businesses, 20 employees or less, pay $10,500 per regulation per year. So I see the market as having a superior method of giving people choices and options, even though, of course, they're rather constrained. They're also constrained when you can't opt out of funding them and they don't face competition. Is there anything to that argument?
Yeah, well, I mean, you'll be shocked to hear that I'm not persuaded, but let me see if I can unpack some of the reasons why. It's certainly true that markets have have lots of turnover, which might be good if that meant if we get better services and products from it. It would certainly be good if you had things like a private policing organization that went out of business somehow because it was being abusive. Although I'm skeptical about that for reasons we can get into in a second. But also, I do want to just flag the fact that this is not, to put it mildly, an unambiguous good, right? If you had more market turnover in a libertarian utopia, then in a sense that would be good for people, in various ways, possibly as customers, but it's going to be very bad for them as workers because every time the invisible hand of the free market does its thing, the way it does its thing is with firm failure, and which means that you have people who are between jobs more often, right, with all of the negatives that come with that. So if somebody is, as most people are, both a worker and a consumer, right, it's not obvious that that's an overall benefit for them, especially if being between jobs is a rougher situation without having some sort of welfare state to fall back on. On the specific examples, right? So your examples: Blockbuster, MySpace, Sears. Sears is a fun one, by the way, because part of the reason, as I understand it, that Sears went belly up was because of an attempt by an executive who was a very enthusiastic libertarian to institute an internal market within the company to provide more incentives for employees. But those other examples, certainly, MySpace, and Blockbuster, those are things that whose business model relies on mass consumption in small quantities by lots and lots of different people, right? Even if you were a huge film buff, you probably weren't individually donating, very much of Blockbuster's revenue, and whereas with private security, it can perhaps be like that, but not necessarily, and not necessarily in the most worrying cases. And I think that there's some historical precedent for thinking that. So, for example, when you think about like Pinkertons who are hired to attack strikers, in the 19th century. The striking workers can withdraw, can withdraw their support for Pinkerton all they want. That's meaningless because they never supported it, in the first place, right? Except in the sense by providing value for the company, which then hired the Pinkertons. That they're going to be reliant on different people in many cases than the people who are victimized by it, right? If we can. So if you have most of the consumers have an incentive to stop supporting things if they're abusive to them, then that's one thing. But if you have a situation like that, where you have individual rich people who are providing massive parts of the Pinkertons, your Rockefellers or whoever, providing a massive part of the Pinkertons' bottom line. then even if they were also being used by other individuals, it's not clear that would help. And similarly, I think even when you go outside of those situations, like mining towns, where everybody's on strike, and the one rich person who owns the place brings in the Pinkertons. Even when you go to more day-to-day kinds of situations, like you have some gated community that where people are using maybe they chip in on it, maybe however it works, right, in the individual case, right, where the more affluent people who live in that gated community are using private security because they're worried about crime from people coming in from the poor neighborhood. Then certainly that kind of mechanism that the victims are going to withdraw their support isn't really, I think, going to be relevant there, because the people who are victims of anything abusive the private police do in the gated community aren't, by and large, going to be the people in the gated community who are paying their salaries. Genuinely, private security forces are very aware of who is or is connected to the people paying their salaries, and who's not, and they act accordingly. Last point about this would be about this more general idea of voting, of voting with our dollars, right? The way that we exercise control as ordinary people in a market economy isn't through the state. It's by our individual. It's by our individual consumer choices, and I would just suggest that the track record of that is not great. Because part of the reason for that is because if you apply that voting metaphor to consumer choices, we're never voting on one thing at once, right? We're never, you're never voting on, like if there, if there's a if there's a Mexican place that you were thinking about going to for lunch, that pays its dishwashers minimum wage, and there's a Chinese place that you're thinking about going to lunch that pays its dishwasher $15 an hour. Then you could say, okay, well, people can vote with their consumer dollars about how much they care, how much they think dishwashers could should be paid. But the problem is, it's not just referendum on how, even if people actually had that information, which realistically they usually don't. But even if they did, it's not just a referendum on that. It's a referendum on whether you feel like Mexican or Chinese. It's a referendum on, how far each of them is from work, and like 1,000 other things that could influence those choices. Whereas the advantage of political action, when we get together collectively, not to buy things or not buy things, although that's, one form it could possibly take, boycotts, but to do things like, vote for Kashama Sawant for the Seattle City Council, because she's running on a platform of, raising the minimum wage, then that allows us to hone in on those discrete issues. So we're not voting on what we want the wage to be in a way that's also mixed up with voting about how we feel about the particular products, which, by the way, is the thing that's going to be in the front of our minds when we make that decision. But we can isolate things and act on them in a different way. And I would suggest it's more psychologically realistic to think that people are going to be able to express these preferences in terms of political action rather than in terms of their consumer decisions.
I think political action might also fall to that same thing. For example, I very much agree with Bernie Sanders on the drug war. He is the one person to mention the mass murder campaign in Yemen that the U.S. and Saudis are engaged in, and I love those, but it's his other policies that I don't want to embrace. I feel like you do sometimes have to. I guess the best example would probably be if we're very worried about one person having too much power. In your example of,
Yeah,
if one guy in the firm is funding the Pinkertons, they're
yeah,
maybe not going to listen to others. If we take Donald Trump as the example, he used to be just in the predatory, profit-seeking private sector as a real estate mogul, jerk firing people.
sorry. It was my fault. My audio went out for a second. So you started to say, if we take Donald Trump as the example.
Yep, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's
Okay.
good.
So if we take Donald Trump as the example, we have someone who was a real estate mogul in the profit-seeking private sector and a billionaire. I know he also inherited a lot of his wealth. He was still much less dangerous as that one percenter than he is as the elected president. Because now, I mean, before he couldn't take a dime out of my pocket unless I voluntarily went to him. And now he's like making executive orders, killing Soleimani, risking world wars, taking trillions of dollars from people, caging people for victimless crimes. So I think the fear that the few would control the many in a voluntary society is actually amplified by the existence of a state, primarily because people don't have that much of an incentive to get involved because it takes a lot of time to get involved and they only get 1 in 150 million vote.
Mm.
And there's also another disincentive where he now, his murder used to be evil. He used to say, I could kill someone on Fifth Avenue and people wouldn't care. Well, no, you can kill millions of people and people won't care, so long as you do it
Well,
under the
not if you do
guise
it on
of
Fifth Avenue. If you do it in Pakistan, they don't care.
if you got to do it in Pakistan, and then arrest anyone who tries to expose it, like Bradley Manning. So,
Yeah.
so that is my real world example of how, if we're afraid of the one tyrant, we should embrace libertarianism instead of socialism. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that so. Okay, first of all, I do want to circle back to the first point you made because I think it's a very fair point, right? Which is that in electoral contexts, we're still generally not voting on one thing at a time, which is absolutely true. I mean, there are contexts in which you are, if you have like a ballot measure or something, you are literally voting on exactly one thing at a time. In other contexts, like voting for candidates, then sure, people face the kind of dilemmas that you're talking about. I still think that it's easier to assemble a coalition of people to focus on just that one issue in that context. Like I suspect, for example, if Bernie had been the nominee during the coronavirus, the election would have been almost single issue about Medicare for all versus keeping the current system, because that was the issue that Bernie was most associated with. Most people are not voting based on the war in Yemen, although I think we probably agree that that's a shame that they should be. But realistically, most Americans aren't focused on that issue. I think it's certainly true that Donald Trump is more dangerous president of the United States than he was as a real estate mogul. But I'd be very hesitant to go from that to the more general conclusion that we should be more worried about state power. Of course, in practice, state power and the power of power within the economy are generally aligned with each other, which you kind of alluded to even earlier with Bowen and all of that. That those are usually rowing in the same direction. But if we had state power, in a democratic socialist state, that was going against private sector power, that we should be more worried about private sector power than we should be about political power. I'd be very reluctant to generalize, and I think one way to start thinking about that is, okay, Donald Trump is president, more dangerous than Donald Trump is real estate mogul, no question about it. You're absolutely right. Donald Trump is real estate mogul in New York City, more dangerous than, say, Councilman Bob on the New York City Council? Probably not, or probably yes, right? Probably he is much more dangerous than him. In fact, he might even be more dangerous because Donald Trump is exerting more influence over the New York City Council than any individual council member might be. But even apart from that, there are lots of respects in which private corporations, especially in a democratic state with constitutional limits about what it could do, etc., that private corporations do actually exercise in a variety of contexts, much more power. So for example, in the United States, as a extremely imperfectly partially democratic state, that does have some important constitutional limitations that might be trampled on in some contexts, but it's very hard to trample on them in other contexts. which one has more, which one has more control over who has more control over whether people get to see this video that we're making right now. Is it Donald Trump or is it whoever the CEO is of YouTube? I understand YouTube's owned by Google. I don't know if they have their own CEO, how that works, right? But like whatever, right? Then some decision maker in YouTube. Pretty clearly it's that second guy. So and I think that if you assume that we are going to have a state, one of the reasons to worry about concentration of private economic powers, because that always leads to concentrated political power. I understand you're not making that assumption, but I would still have very similar worries in that kind of anarcho-capitalist society. If you have that, because there, concentrated economic power is going to mean that you can do things like, hire private security forces that, lots of people can't have. We can get into really fun stuff like, would there be private ownership of nuclear weapons? And if not, what's going to, what's the mechanism for stopping that? But I think that the last thing I would say about this is, look, that Donald Trump can do things like assassinate Soleimani, I think is a lesson in that there is something very wrong with the way that the American political system currently operates, which is that the president of the United States has these crazy emperor-like powers in foreign policy, and we shouldn't have that. That's too much power for any individual to wield. And we should have, look, I think I'm not some obviously conservative, but I'm even not even like some liberal who would get dewy-eyed about the Constitution. I think the U.S. Constitution is very bad in many ways, right? But I think that the way it tries to regulate war powers is good, and that we'd be better off if we found a way to make that more meaningful and to go back to something closer to at least the way it was, before the post-World War II, expansion of the imperial presidency. But I'd also draw a more general conclusion from that, which is that, okay, understand in that case, you have your own reasons for explaining what's wrong with it. It's a state, it's coercive, people are, violating the non-aggression principle. But my lesson from that would be we don't want too much power to be concentrated in the hand of any one individual. And to me, that is also a reason to not want some people to be, business owners, and a much larger number of other people to have to go to work for the first group of people, if they can't get together the money to, start their own businesses. Because that same concern about one person having too much power over other people applies to both. I think it's a reason to not want to have an imperial presidency, but I also think it's a reason not to have a really hierarchical economic system.
Now, there is a big foundational difference between positive rights and negative rights in our philosophies, which is why we start on such different premises, is why we end up different places all over. So let's take your Bob and Jane example.
Yeah.
Bob builds an apartment complex and sustains it, and Jane, let's just say, does not build anything. So
Right.
I see neither of them as just inherently owing me stuff, but I see Bob as offering me a potential place to live and potentially a job to work at the complex. So even if it's an internship for $0 an hour, I'd still be getting on the job experience and all these other things. Do you see, I'm sorry, if you could just explain why you see someone offering me a job, offering me products, offering me services is exploitative, but people who offer me nothing is not exploitative.
Sure. So I think there are two questions there, and I want, or two issues there, and I want to make sure that I address both because they're both important. One was about positive versus negative rights, and the other one was about why capitalism is exploitative in my view, and what that even means. So I guess the second one might be a little bit simpler. So let's start with the second one. So I think that so what do we mean when we say exploitation? There's a way of using that word that just means like treating somebody unfairly or, treating somebody shabbily. But I think that certainly in the traditional socialist use of that word, it means something a little bit more specific, right? So what does it mean? Well, the more specific thing it means is the idea that that people who generate value aren't who manufacture or sell or design, etc. Right? Goods aren't that part of the value that they create is being extracted from them in a process over which they have no meaningful control. And that last part is really important because, of course, even if we organize the economy in a completely different way, any possible way of organizing the economy, we wouldn't just want, we wouldn't just want everybody, we wouldn't just want assuming we, still had money and all of that, right? We wouldn't want every single cent that somebody produces to go back to them in the form of whatever the equivalent are of wages, because of course you need to, in my view, right, we have common needs like schools and hospitals. You need to do something to take care of people who can't work, and also, the most basic thing is that if you do that, then before long you're not producing anything because the factory machinery is going to break down and there's going to be no money reserved to repair it or anything like that. So just having money go towards something other than the needs, or having resources, if we imagine some really really ambitiously utopian, sort of socialist future, having resources be devoted to anything except for the individual consumption of people who produce them isn't bad in itself. It's the no meaningful control over it. So in other words, it's like taxation without representation, that people, that if the people who, like in General Motors, right? The people, the actual workers, whether they're in, engineering or R&D or on the assembly line, or, they're salespeople or what have you, right? The actual workers who design the cars, manufacture the cars, take the cars to the point where they're going to be sold, sell the cars, etc. If they're not getting it because there's this extra part profits that they don't have any control over, that's what I mean by exploitation. And I understand that from your perspective, say, oh, what do you mean they don't have any control over it? They're signing, voluntary contracts, employment contracts, agreeing to work for this wage. What more control do you, could you ask for? But I would say that that realistically, most people don't have any choice except to submit themselves to that kind of arrangement. That most people don't, it's hard to get starter capital to start a business of your own. Most businesses fail very soon, et cetera, et cetera. So most people don't have any realistic choice except for to go to work for a capitalist, meaning a non-worker, owner of the means of production. And maybe you have your choice of capitalists, depending on what the labor market is like at that time, but you certainly don't have any choice in what the basic arrangement is going to be. You don't, that wherever you go, it's going to be the same arrangement, that there's going to be some amount that you get back in the form of a wage, some amount the owner is going to keep in terms of profits. Certainly as an individual worker, you're going to have unfathomably less bargaining power than a company because it's so much easier to replace, especially if we're talking about relatively unskilled jobs, which are going to be most jobs in any economy. It's going to be much easier to replace any worker than it is for a worker to replace their source of income. So I guess I would just emphasize here that it's not, talk about exploitation. Obviously, that's not a neutral term, right? We wouldn't be calling it exploitation if not for the fact that we really dislike it, right? Sometimes it's, sometimes I think Marxists will overshoot this and say, oh, this is just like a descriptive economic term. It's like, well, no, I mean, clearly there's a moral judgment. You wouldn't be calling it exploitation. But I don't think it's a moral judgment on individuals in this process. It's not that, you're a bad person if you're an employer or you're a landlord in the Bob and Jane case, or, or whatever, right? It's that the system is bad. So I think that, like, just as a imperfect analogy, up until relatively recently, historically, the way that marriage works, there's a doctrine called coverture, which meant that a lot of the wife's legal rights would go be transferred to her husband when she got married, and that's obviously a bad, unjust system. Coverture should not exist, but that doesn't mean that any individual man who was proposing marriage to a woman was doing something horrible or should be morally judged for that. It just means that the system is institutionally bad. And I would say similar things in this case, that it's not that you're a terrible person if you run a bodega and you have a couple of employees, or you have, like, you own a property and you rent some of it out or whatever. It's that the system in which some of these people have much more power than the others is unjust. And even though I know we haven't gone to positive and negative rights, I know I've been talking for a long time, so maybe we can go back to positive and negative rights after this. But just before I do that, I'll just say that I think that it's also important, in your way of presenting the Bob and Jane case. You said, well, Bob is like doing something to create this apartment complex, and I think the moral case for property rights is much stronger, or sounds much more compelling the more that you talk like that. And to my mind, at least, it sounds much less compelling as soon as we start thinking about who's actually creating or not creating what, right? That in this case, certainly, the person who owns the apartment complex, even if they're the original owner, right, who commissioned it, which of course in most cases probably is not true, right? But even if they're the original owner, they didn't actually create the apartment complex. A bunch of construction workers did that. They most likely, probably some people are both architects and landlords, but most people aren't, right? So most likely they also didn't design it, right? Some architects, engineers, other people did that. So they oftentimes we say, well, landlords, in return for rent, they do upkeep. Well, even that, with really small scale landlords, that might be true that they do both, right? But that's not what it is to be a landlord. Certainly, landlords certainly at the larger scale will generally hire a super to do that, right? They're not really doing, I mean, again, small landlords might, being a landlord and being a super are still very different things. If a lawyer who's really strapped for cash at a tiny practice sweeps up his own office at night, that doesn't mean that being a janitor is an essential part of being a lawyer. So I would say that the landlord is essentially a middleman, right? Literally a rent seeking middleman between a group of workers, between a bunch of construction workers and architects and et cetera, super, et cetera, and the people who are paying him rent. And just to link it back to the earlier point, my point here is not that if you, that if you're a landlord, even a really petty landlord, you rent out a room in your house or whatever, you're an evil person and I hate you. The point is that I think that there are better ways to organize a society.
Now, I think of, why wages rise, and what generally comes to mind is productivity. In other words, if I have a computer, I can make a lot more sales for the business than if I had to go door to door. So productivity and increased capital increases my benefit to the company and increases my wages, along with competition. So I could go somewhere else, and that's why not everyone gets minimum wage. Why only a small percentage of people get minimum wage. Now, when I think of how to improve let's just say the working class is a group that has legitimate group interests. If I want to improve their well-being, I don't necessarily see collectivizing or becoming voters would improve their standards. The things that come to mind are, if I want a really good book, router, computer, microphone, printer, and cell phone, we
Uh,
wouldn't say, you know, people need to vote on these things this way they're good. I think it's better if people just sort of do their own thing in the division of labor, specialize, and then compete for voluntary funds in the marketplace. How would you respond to that libertarian position, on the just improvement of society as a whole, with a focus on the working class?
yeah. So there's part of what you said that I agree with, which is that I think that this sort of pretty specialized, that having a complex division of labor um, is better than not having one. It comes with downsides, of course. Arguably, people experience their time in a much more alienated way, given that complex division of labor, than if we were all, small farmers or hunter gatherers or whatever. But it's an exchange I'm willing to make, right? I would rather have the benefits of living in a technologically advanced modern society than have the greater, spiritual fulfillment or whatever of being like homesteaded small farmer, hoping that I don't die of typhus at whatever age, so that much I agree with. And I think that any reasonable model of socialism should certainly incorporate the benefits of that complex division of labor. I also agree with you that, and this does get down to some of my disagreements with some other socialists, which is that that you don't want to like have a society where you have to have a big political debate and a vote about like exactly what kind of toothpaste to produce and stuff like that, right? That sounds awful. um, I've certainly spent enough hours of my life, at faculty meetings that I'm never going to get back. That I think I have a vivid, like that sounds like a Tales from the Crypt, ironic punishment or something, right? You have to be in a meeting forever, right? I don't want that. So I agree with you about those 2 points, and I think that's why I think that at least right now, the kind of any kind of socialism that would be achievable right now would have to incorporate some market mechanisms for some things that we don't, even if you had like a private or quasi-private sector where you had worker-owned firms, or possibly worker-owned firms essentially renting the physical means of production from a larger collective entity. Then for exactly that reason that you said about you don't want to vote on every stupid damn thing all the time. In fact, that would really piss away a lot of what I would see as the advantages of a better kind of economic system. That I want a society where we have free time for our non-economic lives, not one where we have a lot less of it. So I totally agree with you about those. For anybody who is interested, so because I want to stay on topic, but anybody who's interested in what that might look like, you can watch a video that I did on the Jacobin YouTube channel with my friend Bhaskar Sankara. It was very recently, like in the last couple of weeks. It's called something like what would a fully socialist model that would work in the real world look like, or something like that. Anyway, so there's a deep dive in there on the details. Or people can check out a book called After Capitalism by David Schweikart. But I just want to flag that because I don't want to just sort of hand wave, we'll have some kind of socialism that'll have the good things and won't have the bad things. Just trust me, there's some way to work all this out, right? Because that would be, I think pretty cheap, So check my work, right? Go look at those things. But I think it's also significant on the productivity issue that you mentioned, that as a matter of fact, we can argue about what the causes are of this, and whether there's some sort of libertarian explanation that it's because our free market isn't quite free enough, or there's the sort of opposite explanation that somebody like me would probably like. But as a matter of fact, in the actual world, if you look at the last few decades, there have been enormous productivity gains, and wages certainly real wages, tend to stagnate. So that kind of relationship between productivity and wages, at the very least, we can say in actually existing capitalist economies is is definitely not an automatic one. I think it's true that some people who have individual kinds of jobs where they're individually adding tons of value um, to a firm are going to be in a position to negotiate for higher wages if you have skills that are relatively unusual. And that phrase "that are relatively unusual" is crucial. This is why the one of many reasons why telling unemployed coal miners they should just go learn to code doesn't really cut it, because if everybody learned to code, then you wouldn't, then having that skill would be as worthless on the labor market as being able to flip a burger. And so I think that. So I think that even though there are individual skilled workers who are in a position to negotiate for better wages, I think that when you have relatively unskilled workers, and by unskilled, I don't mean like that there's no actual skill. There are tons of jobs we call unskilled that, my lazy ass would definitely be incapable of doing, but I just mean like that don't require specialized education. That's all, right? So I think when you have relatively unskilled jobs, which are going to be most jobs in any possible economy, that, even if you give people the fairest of fair shots at competing for the better ones, most jobs are going to be those relatively unskilled ones. And that when you have those relatively unskilled labor, if the productivity of that labor increases, then that by itself, there's no automatic way that leads to greater wage growth. And if you have again, if you have particularly in-demand skills and, a good labor market, then maybe you can, shop around into different employers. But I think most people aren't going to be able to do that. Most employers are not going to be so hard up, for most jobs, that like they're going to say, hey, great, we got increased productivity, then we have increased profits, and they have very little incentive to share that property with workers, absent some sort of collective action like, forming a labor union or political action to increase wages. And last point about this, that we would just be this, that it's true that most people don't quite literally make minimum wage, but I think that can be a little bit misleading. That okay, so lots of people don't make minimum wage because they didn't just start working at a company. They've been working there for a few years, and they've gotten extremely small wage raises every 6 months or whatever, since they started. But lots of people are in the neighborhood of minimum wage. Certainly the kinds of minimum wage raises that are currently politically controversial. Like going up to $15 an hour, massive percentage of workers' wages would be raised, by those raises, right? So even if it's not a black or white thing, it's not quite that employers can necessarily get away with keeping people if they pay them exactly minimum wage forever, right? That even very unskilled workers might individually have a little bit more bargaining power than that. But it's also not that they have that individual workers are going to have so much individual bargaining power that their lives are not going to be made massively better by minimum wage increases, which I would argue at least is the case.
My colleague at the Libertarian Institute, Sheldon Richmond, identifies as a left libertarian, and he says the reason H. Lee Scott and Doug McMullen, two CEOs of Walmart, and Jeff Bezos come out in favor of the minimum wage is because they can afford it, their competition can't, and it will exclude them from the labor market, giving us workers less options, fewer places to work, less bargaining power. So just as people say we can't have a license to vote because then it stops a lot of people from voting. Well, having a license to get a business stops a lot of people from opening a business. It gives us less options as employees, less options as consumers. That increases prices, that decreases our ability to influence the economy. I know we've gone over, but if you could please just
Sure,
give
sure.
a
Let's
quick
do it.
answer to that.
Sure, let's do a minute on that, and also because you raised it earlier, it's an important, and we never got to it. After that, maybe we can loop back to the positive and negative rights, because I think that's worth talking about for for a minute, even if we are, running up at the amount of time we're going to spend. So yeah, I think that I think that it may be true in some cases, right? I mean, and let's also remember in the Walmart case that I think that the Walmart CEO said, oh yeah, we should have. Doug McMillan, said the federal minimum wage is too low. I don't know exactly what he said it should be raised to. Certainly, Walmart pays even people who've worked there many years less than $15 in many cases. So I don't think he supports the fight for 15, the movement for a $15 minimum wage, or at least that would be my guess. But look, it might be true, right, that there are some cases, maybe even including this one. I think that's plausible. Where there are small businesses that are just barely scraping by, and if you increase their costs, then by, for example, making them pay people a wage they can actually live on and afford rent and groceries and all that stuff, don't have to get a second job or a third job, just to feed their families, that those businesses would go under. And if those businesses going under meant that there was a overall increase, significant overall increase in the unemployment rate. Oftentimes when people talk about minimum wage, they act as if any increase in the unemployment rate at all means that, you're hurting the very people that you want to help, that it's actually, which I've always thought was a sloppy argument, because just because there's some increase in unemployment, even if that's true, and there are a lot of studies that suggest it's actually not, but even if that's true, then just having some increase in unemployment doesn't necessarily mean it's a net negative to the working poor if most people who are affected by it have higher wages, but some people, lose their jobs, especially because losing a job doesn't necessarily mean you've lost it forever. And also especially because people who support minimum wage increases generally also support an enhanced social safety net to make it not as bad to lose your job. Again, I'd point out that I think especially if you look at the meta studies rather than individual studies on all sorts of topics can be incredibly misleading. That's how people end up believing that plants can think and coffee cures cancer. But if you look at meta studies where people pool together the results of lots of different studies, I remember the Center for Economic Policy Research did a good one on this. A review that they did a paper that reviewed a bunch of these meta studies that seemed to show overall that there's either very slight or no increased unemployment. Because of the minimum wage increases. I know people will argue forever about methodology and all this, although I'd also say that if it takes like that finely built a methodological net to catch the unemployment increases, then the increases aren't as bad as people were suggesting. But if smaller businesses going under doesn't mean that there's an increase in unemployment, it just means that larger businesses gobble up some of the market share that smaller businesses had. And that this, so the actual long-term employment rate stays about the same, then I would say, okay, good. Then because if business A can only stay in business by paying people poverty wages, that's what's propping up their business model, and business B can afford to pay people higher wages. Because my concern is with the welfare of the workers. I'm going to say if business B ends up hiring the people who used to work at business A, then great, I'm all for it. And I understand the argument you're making, but the reason that doesn't move me very much is because it's I'm not convinced that in practice the ability of workers to shop around between different employers actually has all that much benefit. I think that generally speaking, that the idea, this really gets back to the idea that we talked about earlier, that you can like vote with your dollars. And I'm skeptical of that, even for markets for consumer goods, that people really exercise that much power by voting with their dollars. And I'm even more skeptical of it when it comes to the labor market, that workers, exercise that much power by shopping around, between different employers. I think that it is probably good. Well, it's definitely good, right? That people have, multiple places that they can work, right? They don't have to choose between working at one place and not being able to work. But if we're not talking about that situation, if we're just talking about relative decreases, people have fewer options, then because I'm skeptical that this is in practice a way that people exercise that much power in the first place, I'm more than willing to trade that, to have like the sort of pedantic technical way to put this is to have less exit and more, especially if those larger businesses are easier to unionize, because instead of being spread out among a bunch of different places where people have to, negotiate with a bunch of different individual employers, then you people are centralized in a way that makes it together to get them together and unionize them. Then I'd say, well, okay, you might have less exit, but you have more voice, within the firm, now, because you get to negotiate, union contracts. Then I would say that sounds to me like plausibly an increase in the power that workers are actually wielding in practice, and especially because we know, like we can look at lots of societies where you historically and even now, right, where you have less regulation, and might be easier to start a business perhaps, that in the 19th century, I expect licensing requirements and stuff, hadn't quite built up to what the modern regulatory state was. And doesn't seem to me that workers were getting a lot of mileage out of their ability to shop around between employers. So I think I'd say less exit, although still some exit, but more voice, fair trade.
Okay, and I just really have two more things that I really want to sort of get at the heart of. Um, uh, could you just explain why you support positive rights
Yeah,
as opposed to negative rights?
Yep. So some negative rights are absolutely very important, no doubt about that. The right to the right to freely practice your religion, for example, right? Like is a very important negative right. I wouldn't that it would be horrible if we didn't have. We could keep listing lots and lots of examples, right? So lots of negative rights are good and important. But I also think that some positive rights are good and important. Rights to have things provided to you. And those positive rights are good and important for a few different reasons. So some of those reasons are just purely about good consequences. If you have a right to health care that's recognized by the political entity that you live in, for example, then you're not going to have diabetics dying, because their GoFundMe for their insulin, wasn't quite funded. So some of those, kinds of pragmatic things are a big part of why I think that's so important. But also, I think that because there's a sense of human freedom that should be very important to us, that's just not captured by a purely negative conception of rights. So if you imagine, for example, that we were just talking about different kinds of labor markets, where people have more or less, people have more or less options about where to go to work. If you imagine that you have the kind of labor market where people have relatively fewer options, and you also imagine that this arose in an immaculate way, it wasn't because of government regulation or anything like that, right? It was just because things happened to work out that way in that region at that time. If we think that that's possible, so you have to, in order to go to work, the only job you can find is one where you have to work 16 hours a day. So you're pretty much either at work or you're sleeping. Or the only job that you can find is one where, a condition of employment is that you date your supervisor, and that's just written into your contract. Or the only job that you can find is one where you have to practice, your boss's religion or whatever, right? Then none of these things, I think, would violate any sort of non-aggression principle if they arose the right way. But these are all, it seems to me, things that really decrease the amount of freedom that we care the most about, right? Which is not sort of abstract freedom of contract, but our ability in practice to determine the sources of our own lives. So if so for example, take the current system of mostly employer health insurance, and imagine, and then think about what I would like to have happen, right? Which is that the health insurance industry be nationalized, that we have Medicare for all. Then that's certainly, if you think that the most important right at stake here is the negative right of the health insurance company to do business, then this is an increase in unfreedom. But I would argue that it's in a dimension that I think most people are going to care more about. They should care more about. It's a great increase in human freedom, because right now, people stay in jobs that they hate because they don't want to lose their employer health insurance. Employers get to control all kinds of things about people because they know that if they lose their job, they're going to lose their health insurance. Their family is going to lose their health insurance if they have it through them. And so that's like hey, you're going to keep your mouth shut at work if you're worried that losing your job is going to have that consequence. And whereas you have a much easier time telling your boss to fuck off and just leaving, right? Exercising that power of exit, if you're not worried that it's going to mean you lose your health insurance. Right now, there are people who stay in bad or even abusive marriages where part of the reason is that they don't want to lose their spousal health insurance. So I think that in general, if you have these kinds of basic needs that we all have, every time one of those needs can only be met privately, then that means that if you're not in a position to directly provision it for yourself, then you have to rely on the goodwill of somebody else who can withdraw it whenever they want to. That you have to tell a convincing, sufficiently compelling sob story on GoFundMe that your GoFundMe goes viral. You have to, in the old-fashioned way, right? I remember at the 2012 Republican debates, the moderator asked Ron Paul, what would happen, with somebody who didn't buy health insurance, who needs surgery, and he said, well, in the old days, we would have taken up a collection at the church, so even apart from, I think, the obvious inadequacy of this in a complex, pluralistic society, where not everybody necessarily, goes to any church at all, then much less, that sort of conception of everybody going to like the village church, then the problem is that means you have to throw yourself at the mercy of these people who might want to know, or you live in what they regard as an upstanding Christian life, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if that's just something that's considered to be a social right that's just provisioned by the state as a matter of course, that there's no individual, there's no individual government bureaucrat even, who's in a position to deny it to you, that would be illegal, right? Everybody, that you just get it, right? It's not means tested. No caseworker has to decide, whether you get it or not. You just get it automatically, like, the way that everybody automatically gets covered by the fire department. You don't have to buy, fire insurance, whatever. I think that that is something that really increases our autonomy in practice, our ability to live our lives whichever way we want, without worried about, what other people think. And I think it's something that greatly increases, human dignity, that you don't have to beg for these things. You just get them automatically. So even if I believed that, to cycle back to the beginning of the conversation, even if I believed that everybody, the sort of current distribution of property is as it should be, right? And that everybody has a pretty good claim, on what they have to begin with. I think that there are other values that would plausibly override it when it comes to the question of whether or not these are things that should be considered social rights that everybody gets just purely, for being human.
And just to clarify my
Yeah.
position, the reason I oppose positive rights is because if I have a right to a house and a house only comes into existence as a result of people working for it, that then entitles me to force other people to perform labor against their will. Also, I don't believe people should be forced to fund things against their will. Another reason is granting someone a right doesn't necessarily increase access. So, for example, we now have a guaranteed free universal right to protection by the police, and they
Uh,
do a horrific job and cage people for victimless crimes and plant evidence and all that stuff. We have 307,000 veterans dying in the Veterans Association. So the existence of, the state granting something a right does not necessarily increase quality or increase access in the way we have an increased access to things like electronics and things that generally are done in the voluntary sector. I also see, like, let's take Richard Wolff.
uh,
Richard Wolff does not provide me health care
uh,
or education. I don't see him violating my rights because he doesn't provide me with those. I think if I that I need to focus on getting those things voluntarily because all of my rights do put obligations on other people. So that is my
yeah,
position.
I want to be clear on what obligations they put on other people, right? Because if you have a right to housing, for example, that doesn't actually mean that anybody has an obligation to like work as a construction worker building that housing, just as the fact that like Canada, for example, or Great Britain in an even more radical way have recognized a right to health care. That doesn't mean that anybody is legally forced to be a doctor or a nurse or an orderly or anything else. What it means is that you have a right to have the tab for that picked up by the state, so ultimately as taxpayers. So I think that the more target like focused objection from your perspective wouldn't be that anybody's being forced to provide that labor. They aren't, right? It's that it's that if they have a certain income that they're being forced to spend a certain part of that income paying for it, which which obviously I'm okay with. We have a very deep disagreement there, but also I'd say on the question of access and quality, then look, the Veterans Administration is a very small scale version of the National Health Service. In the VA hospitals are actually owned by the government, which goes beyond the Canadian model. But if you compare, well, first of all, I do tend to think some of the VA stuff has been very exaggerated for political reasons. If you actually look at, say, like customer satisfaction surveys, people who are either active duty servicemen or in the VA actually have the very highest rating of satisfaction with the services they're getting, followed only by seniors on Medicare, and then followed by people on various private health insurance plans. Now, granted, you can say maybe most people haven't had to use them, although I think that seniors and veterans are some of the people most likely to have actually used their health insurance. But look, I'm sure that the VA is very underfunded, but I think part of the reason is that the overwhelming majority of the public don't use it. Right? They're not veterans, so the political costs of underfunding it are going to be relatively minimal. Whereas in a society like Great Britain, where everybody uses the VA, it's very imperfect. There are lots of problems. We could argue about what causes those problems, and whether that has to do with the way that Tory governments and New Labour even have undermined the NHS for decades. But even now, even with it being undermined in various ways, the rate of British people on average live longer than Americans. They're less likely to die at birth. The infant mortality is better. Their mortality subject to medical intervention or whatever the technical phrase is. People dying of curable diseases is lower. So it seems to me. It seems to me that we would have a disagreement about the empirical part there too. Is it actually the case? Is it actually the case that quality and access are typically served by making these things, public and taking them out of the market? And I think that it's plausible that in some cases that wouldn't be true. That if we had if the toothpaste industry were nationalized and you just got your government toothpaste, in the mail every month, that the quality would be lower than what we get at the store. But I think that when it comes to healthcare, I would say, and we can talk about some of the reasons for this. I think it's much less realistic to think that people are going to window shop for health insurance plans than they are for toothpaste. But I think that the empirical results do show that we get those things. And I know that there are a lot of aspects of this that we could sit around and argue about for another hour. But I mean, I guess I would just say that, like, to me, the most interesting part of the discussion is is this in some way important way involuntary? Is there a big voluntariness objection to this? Because I think that's my guess is the part that that you're that is most, even if you think those are all good reasons to oppose it, right? Like that might be the part that inspires the most moral passion, and I don't think so, because I think that that any possible distribution of property requires enforcement. That if there's not any sort of enforcement mechanism, then property becomes pretty meaningless pretty fast. If there's nothing to stop other people from using something that you regard as your legitimate property, or is legally regarded as your legitimate property, that law isn't worth much. And so I think that whether we're talking about evicting trespassers or assessing taxes or whatever, I think there is going to be some sort of coercive enforcement mechanism in any case. I think the question is just, is it a justified coercive enforcement mechanism? And that, to my mind, gets back to the very first subject we talked about, which is a justified distribution of property just whatever happens to result from a market, or do other considerations like fairness come into play?
Final question. We can just use this as a lightning
Sure.
round. Thank you so much for your time,
Yeah,
Professor.
sure.
If I am a business owner, I might say something like, I do not have a lot of freedom. I am essentially a slave to the consumers. If I don't work hard to please them, they go somewhere else, and all my work has been for nothing.
Yeah.
The workers get money within a couple weeks. I don't make returns for years on all the time and money I've invested in this unpaid adventure of mine. So, would you consider business owners and entrepreneurs virtually enslaved to consumers?
No. You said it was a lightning round, so I'll just do the monosyllable, and then if you want to
Good.
respond.
Terrific, terrific.
Okay, okay. Sorry. If you want, I don't want to be. Sorry, your image was frozen there for a second. If I don't, I don't want to be. I don't want to be obnoxious about this. If you want me to expand on that just a little bit, I could. I would just say, I would just say no. I don't think so. I think that it's certainly true that if that everybody, that there are certain things that, like, business owners don't have control over, that they're subject to market forces, and that their decisions are going to be based on that more than they are going to be by their individual whims. I think in some cases that's a reason to want certain things not to be in the market at all, because if people were just deciding things by their individual whims, then they might benevolently make decisions that that market pressures won't allow them to make. So, quick example that we're all right now. I don't know about you, but I've gone outside a lot less in the last 6 months than I have before that, and part of that has been because even after Mars and SIRS, MERS and SARS, I think I messed up the vowels there. There wasn't nearly as much research into respiratory ailments as there should have been. Not because the people who are like CEOs of pharmaceutical companies are morally evil and they didn't want to address that problem if it came up, but because of the immediate market pressures on them to not spend a lot of money researching something that might come up years later, but to focus on products that they would be able to sell in the very short term. So in that, like, very loose sense, if you want to say business owners are enslaved to the market, okay. I mean, I think that would be a little overheated, but I think that there is a sense in which that's true. And actually a sense in which even people who make money as small businessmen, for example, could be more free in a system where they weren't, reliant on the market in that way, because they have, if I have to, bust my ass all day and all night to try to keep this little business, that's always on the edge of bankruptcy going, and then I don't have any time to spend, with my family, I don't have any time to pursue any other projects, then am I more in control of what's going on in my life than I am if I have a very if I have a job, right? I'm not the owner, but I don't, but I have my needs met in the same way that I was running that business to try to make happen, right? I started that business to try to provide a good life for my family. If I have that met in some other way, and I also have a lot more time in my life and a lot more security to pursue other projects, am I more free or I'm less free? Well, I'm in less control of what's going on in the workplace than I was before, but in other respects, I'm more free. And really, I think that my question would be, look, there's a reason why, the other reason besides supporting their family, why people want to be small businessmen so much. Why is that so appealing to so many people, right? Well, okay, so part of it's making money, but oftentimes, there are lots of businesses where you're never going to make that much money, that that you're always going to be on the verge of going out of business. Why do you want to start your own business? It's because of the autonomy, the idea that you're not working for others. That you get to be you get to be working yourself. That you do get, even if you are a slave to those market pressures, like you were talking about. There's some sense in which you're the captain of your own ship. And so what I want is to say, well, look, if we have the, the problem with that is that not everybody can have that, but at least if we have some democratic way of running firms, so nobody has the kind of power that a single owner has, but that all have a lot more power than an individual capitalist employee has. And so I think that very thing that makes people want to be small business owners, I think, is why I'd like to have a more democratic economy. And I know that was not remotely lightning round. I just after I said it, I just felt cheap and evasive to just say no and let you end.
Hey, no problem at all. I greatly appreciate it. I was just doing it to respect your time. The name of the podcast is Give Them an Argument. Is you have a book by the same title?
I do. Yep.
And what are the other books, so the audience can check them out?
Sure. So this is the first one. Give Them an Argument. There's also Myth and Mayhem: A Leftist Critique of Jordan Peterson, which I have a chapter in. It's primarily written by Marion Trejo and Matt McManus and Conrad Hamilton. Introduction by Slavoj Žižek. And then, as far as solo authored book, this one isn't out yet, but you can pre-order it. Always want to plug as a place to pre-order it. There's a worker-owned bookstore in Baltimore called Red Emma's. That's redemmas.org, where you can pre-order it. This is Canceling Comedians While the World Burns: A Critique of the Contemporary Left. That's coming out in the spring, and you could read my stuff at Jacobin. And if you're not sick of me after that, is the YouTube channel associated with the podcast. Just youtube.com/Ben Burgis GTAA for Give Them an Argument. That there's lots of stuff in between episodes there, live streams and things like this. So thank you for having me on.
Of course, all those links will be in the description below. Mr. Burgis, thank you for your time. To the audience, thank you for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone.
All right. Thanks, Keith.